Good afternoon, everyone. And before I start, I'd like to thank Brendan McGowan and his colleagues for inviting me to the wonderful city of Galway to talk on the Paisley shawl and the Galway shawl. As Brendan said, there's no books on the Galway shawl. Very little has been written, very little research done on the Galway shawl, but it does have a context. It's part of the whole Paisley shawl production period in the 19th century. It came at the very last part of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. So it's part of that family. And if we look at that family, we can see the relationship between the Galway shawl and the Paisley shawl. And if we look at how the Paisley shawl was produced, how it was designed and all that, we can tell a lot from about the Galway shawl through looking at the Paisley shawl. So basically, what I'm going to do is show you, I'm going to talk about the Paisley shawl and then into the Galway shawl. And a lot of what I've said about, or what I will say about the design and the methods of production can be easily transferred over to the Galway shawl. So Paisley was famous throughout the 19th century for producing what they call the Paisley shawl. And the Paisley shawl is not just one item, it's a whole series of shawls, because it was a fashion garment. And the essence of fashion is that it changes all the time, because if it doesn't change, it's not fashionable. So the Paisley shawl was a fashion item, and it changed right through the century. It evolved to produce lots of different types. So you can see on the screen there the various types. There's the striped ones that were called zebra shawls. And the predominant motif was that teardrop pattern, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. And that they produced the shawls in such abundance during the 19th century that this teardrop, which was initially Indo-Persian design, it became known as the Paisley pattern. It's now universally known as the Paisley pattern, called after the town in Paisley, as I said, because it produced these shawls in such abundance. And the last type of shawl they produced was the fur shawl, or the velvet shawl. Now, there was no fur or velvet in the shawl. It was a heavy woolen shawl, completely unlike what they produced before, but it had a nap on the surface of it, which gives a texture of fur, so they called it the fur shawl. But the term velvet is actually a technical term for the finish of the shawl. When you raise a nap on the shawl, which is to raise the fibers up like that to produce a nice surface on it, that's called the velvet finish. So that's why they're called, in Paisley, they're called the velvet shawl or the fur shawl. So I'll just give you a background on the Paisley itself. Paisley is a town in the southwest of Scotland. It's about 7 miles west of Glasgow. And it was famous even before the shawl for its weaving trade. It really grew around an abbey that was built there in the 12th century by Benedictine monks from Cluny in France. And the reason they chose the site, or one of the reasons they chose the site, was because of the work of an Irishman who preceded him by 5 centuries, called Mirren, who was an abbot in Bangor, in County Down. And he is said to have come over with St. Columba, and he settled in Paisley and preached in Paisley and set up a settlement there. So the reason they chose the abbey, the site of the abbey, was because of the work of this Irishman 5 centuries previously. And today, the local football team is called St. Mirren. There's a river in the town called St. Mirren. So St. Mirren is everywhere in Paisley. And they call the local team the Saints as well, I think. So Paisley, there's no record of weaving in Paisley until 1695. Before that, the weaving was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. It's not like today where you have a few big companies who supply the whole world with cloth. Years ago, weaving was in every village, every town. So we know there was weaving there, but there's actually no record of it until 1169. And at that time, it was a poll tax roll that contains these records, because they were imposing a poll tax on people, and they had to get the names of all the tradespeople in the house and all that, so in the town. So out of a population of, I think it was 1,200, there was 66 weavers, 20 journeymen, and 13 apprentices, bringing the total to 99. So it was the largest trade in the town. So it shows that Paisley was beginning to specialize in weaving at the time. But it was still a very small hamlet, just one street, a few lanes off it. But in a matter of maybe 100 years, little more than 100 years, it became a powerhouse of weaving. There was a huge flourishing of textile production in Paisley. And as I said, in a very short period of time, it became one of the most important textile production towns in Britain, and even then expanded its sales of its textiles worldwide. So you have, for instance, the Coates and Clark's company, which were two local companies, and they amalgamated at the end of the 19th century, and they expanded to 70 different countries. And at one stage, they supplied 90% of the world's sewing thread. And in 1900, they were the third biggest company on the stock exchange. So Paisley had a huge expansion of textiles. And then there was lots of byproducts of the textile trade. For instance, Brown and Polson, that started as a weaving company in Paisley who were producing muslins, and they used the starch for the cloth when they were producing it. And then they discovered, obviously, some way or other that they could actually produce edible starch and all that. So they turned out, and they become a very big company as well. And also Paisley is an interesting fact. I think it had the first filtered water probably in the world, definitely in Britain. Yeah, I would say in the world. And that again was from a textile company they were producing very fine lawns and muslins, and they needed very clean water. So they actually arranged a filtering system through the sand and all that. And the surplus water they sold to the town. So Paisley had, through the textile trade, had filtered water before most of the rest of the world. And also, as I said earlier, the town gave its name to worldwide now in the English language to the design, the Paisley pattern. So if you look at the trade directories of the 19th century, you can see it's just full of everything related to textiles: spinners, calendars, finishers, manufacturers of starch, everything to do with dyers, warpers, weavers, everything to do with weaving. And even today, the legacy of the weaving trade can still be seen in the town in the architecture and the street names. So if you look at the streets named there, Silk Street, Cotton Street, Mill Street, and that's not them all. These are just ones that I managed to do during lunchtime one day. And the architecture of the town hall was built it's called the Clark's Town Hall. So it's the Clark's Thread Company put the money up for that. The church there is the Coates Memorial Church, after Thomas Coates, the thread manufacturer, and it's the largest Baptist church in Europe. Very elaborate inside. I think the local Baptist didn't like all this ostentatious thing, but it is actually the largest Baptist church in Europe. And again, built on the textile money. The same with the observatory, and the building on the top is the remnant of the huge Coates weaving factories, which were in Paisley, and it's now flats dwellings. And of course, the town is full of weavers' cottages as well. You can see the thatched weavers' cottage there. And there's only two of them left. And the museum itself was built by Thomas Coates from the spinning firm. So there was a number of elements came together which propelled Paisley to the forefront of textile production. And the first was the Act of Union in 1707, which was the union of the two, Scotland and England. And that opened up the markets to the Scottish merchants and manufacturers. They were given exactly the same access to the markets as in England, as the English manufacturers, but also because of the expanding empire, they were given the access to the markets of the empire. So they had a huge market. And when the salesmen at the time, which were called the packmen, they brought down the Paisley goods to England and sold them there. But they also came back up with new ideas. And one of the new ideas was silk weaving, which they were doing silk weaving in Spitalfields, which is very famous for its weaving. So they decided to start gauze weaving in Paisley in 1759, start producing this silk gauze. And you can see some of the gauze fabrics. They're very, very delicate. Sometimes you can hardly see them with the human eye without, you need the aid of a magnifying glass. And they're very, very intricate structures. a very, very high level of skill required to produce them. Produced on relatively simple looms, but the looms were set up in such a way to produce this very complex fabric. And this took off amazingly fast. And within a year, Thomas Fulton, who introduced it, he was employing 600 weavers in this trade. And they were so successful that they outdid the Spitalfield weavers, and the 6, I think, of the Spitalfield weavers, the companies moved to Paisley. And then they had agents in the capital cities throughout Europe, including Dublin. So a lot of the silks were being sold here in Ireland as well. And if you want to look at the type of fabrics that were producing, then it's always a good idea to look at the artwork of the period, because a lot of the silk, for instance, the silk gauzes are extremely delicate and they don't last at all. We have a couple of books, which I think I showed you last side. On the right-hand side, we have, that's pages from a silk gauze book, which we have in the museum. It dates 1770. But if them fabrics were out of the book and were worn, they wouldn't be around now at all, because they would disintegrate. They're very, very delicate, very expensive, high fashion item, really. And as I say, if you want to see how the fabrics were used, you can see here, I think this is Sargent's painting of some of the high society ladies. So you can see how the silk gauze was used. And even the French weavers were complaining that the Paisley gauzes were being used in the French court over the French weavers. So the weavers were pretty good at their job. And of course, the salespeople were obviously very good as well. And then in the 1780s, this is where another strand comes in, and it's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where the inventions of Hargreaves, of Arkwright, and of Crompton introduced the automatic spinning of yarn. And it was cotton that they were producing at the time. And of course, cotton was coming in abundance from the States and from India and from Egypt. So you had a blending then of the handloom weaving and the introduction of the Industrial Revolution. And this gave rise to these huge factories which were producing a phenomenal amount of really high quality cotton yarn. And the weavers then turned to producing figured cotton muslin instead of the silk, and the silk went out of fashion. And there was if you look at the top left-hand side, that's the fly shuttle. So that was invented in 1733, and it was introduced in Paisley in about the 1770s, and that multiplied what they could do by threefold. So they were producing a huge range of this, and as I say, they had the markets worldwide for it through the empire. So it was a huge trade in Paisley. Another branch of this trade was where they produced plain muslin, and then they did designs which were printed on using printing blocks, and this was cut up into various sizes and all that, and it was sent out to the girls in the countryside and all that, and they embroidered it, they produced the embroidered designs. And also the manufacturers had agents in various places, and it expanded into Ireland. The manufacturers, there was about 400 agents in Ireland, and there was, they reckon, 200,000 girls in Ireland doing sewed muslin and tambour work. If you look at the bottom image, it's a sort of a chain stitch, which was done by a tambour needle. So it was called tambour work or sewed muslin. And as I said, what they did was that they put them in, the agents sent them out into the countryside and gave them to girls there. And apparently when they came back, they had to be washed because the girls were sometimes milking the cows and there were all that sort of thing. And so they had to, and there was smoke on them where they're doing it at the fireside and all that. So then they were brought back to Paisley, washed and sold as finished goods. This was an extraordinary period for the weavers in Paisley. It's known as the golden age of handloom weaving. And as I said before, the trade was very, very successful, but the weavers were well paid at the time, because with the introduction of the fly shuttle, they could do 3 times as much as they could do before that. And They worked in a system called the domestic system or the putting out system. So the Paisley weavers didn't work in factories. They got their raw material from the manufacturer and brought it to their workshop. And it was a small workshop, maybe 4 to 6 weavers in it, and they could weave it up in their own time. As long as they got it done, they were given a weaver's ticket. They had to have it back in 3 weeks or whatever. So they were fairly well paid, and they could take time off. And the Paisley weavers put this to really good use. And they formed lots of educational societies. They had musical societies, book clubs. They'd get together and they'd buy maybe 2 or 3 books, and then they'd pass it around and read it. And then they'd meet. They'd have a meeting, maybe hire a room over a pub, and on maybe Thursday night, they'd all go up and they'd discuss all what they have read and all that. They'd also discuss the trade. That was a wee bit of the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment, where clubs were really, really important, where they're exchanging ideas. Well, the weavers were doing the same in Paisley. They were exchanging ideas about the weaving, but also about other things. So they had, for instance, the second botanical society in the whole of Britain was formed by the Paisley weavers. They were very fond of ornithology. They studied that, and a lot of them considered themselves poets. There's actually 2 volumes of Paisley poets. There's over 200 poets in it, and the vast majority of them are weavers. I have to say their weaving was far ahead of their poetry. But 2 of them stand out, and that's Alexander Wilson, who was a weaver in Paisley, and he was a very good poet, and he wrote some very controversial poems in Paisley. He was jailed for it, but it wasn't that he was incarcerated for a period. It was just more or less a symbolic thing. He had to burn his, but he didn't like the whole thing, so he went to America. And because of the culture that was embedded in him in Paisley with their ornithology and all that, he studied the birds of America and is now known as the father of American ornithology. He's the first person, and he drew all these birds himself. He did actually the drawings for them and all that. But the roots of all that was already established in Paisley. The other poet is Robert Tannahill, and he was a weaver poet as well. He died very young, but he's produced quite a lot of work. They say he wrote "Will You Go, Lassie Go," but I'm not 100% sure of that, I think. So the next product that was produced in the town after the silk and the cotton was known as the imitation Indian shawl, and it was an imitation of the cashmere shawl. This was a really difficult thing to weave, and although it was very lucrative to begin and to produce these shawls, there was only about less than 12 weaving centres. Now, this is at the height of the weaving trade in Europe. There was less than 12 of the weaving centres in Europe that took up this because they didn't have the skill and the expertise to do it. But Paisley, because of the previous experience with the silk trade, the cotton trade, they had an abundance of weavers who were very willing to accept the challenge to try and reproduce these Indian shawls. The Kashmir was famous for centuries, for producing these very fine decorative shawls. And in Kashmir, they were a man's item of clothing, and usually woven or worn by the upper class, the Mughal emperors and his court and all that. So you can see them here. The green on the right, you can see it's worn over the shoulder and down over the arm, and you can see the decoration on the edge of it. So again, it's the artwork which we can see this. And then through various circumstances, especially the British East India Company, the Dutch trading companies, the Napoleonic incursions into Egypt and all that, they came back to Europe and they became very, very fashionable among the aristocratic ladies of Europe. So there's numerous paintings of French and other aristocratic women wearing these shawls, and the shawls are really, really carefully painted because it was a badge of, it showed your wealth, it showed your status, it showed your taste, and they were extremely expensive. My predecessor in Paisley Museum said in one of her talks, she said the price of one shawl would pay for a townhouse in London. I think that might be an exaggeration, but I would say there'd be in the region of today's, it could be up as £50,000 or something to that effect. It's very, very expensive. So the method, the reason why they were expensive is that there's several reasons, but the two main ones is that the fibers were very fine, very rare, one of the rarest fibers on earth. They came from the underbelly of a Himalayan goat who only produced the fiber in the winter time. And they had to be beyond a certain altitude. They had to be really cold. This is common in very, very cold areas where animals actually produce an undercoat which keep them warm. Even the dogs in some very, very high altitudes produce this very fine fibers. So this Himalayan goat produced these very fine fibers. They were harvested, and the weavers in Kashmir produced these very, very fine shawls out of them. That drawing is by, I think his name is Simpson, and he was a Glasgow artist who was over in Kashmir at the time. And it's usually two or three men sat at loom, and I'll show you in the next slide how they put in all the decorative details by hand. So they had hundreds of bobbins in front of them. The design was actually encoded in a system of letters and marks. So somebody would either call out that to them, or they'd have it written in front of them. And then all the little tiny details, like you see on the top and on the bottom, the lower with all the paisley pattern, all they were put in by hand in what they call a tapestry, a twill tapestry method. So it could take two weavers a year or 18 months to weave one shawl. So that's why they were so expensive. Now, the European manufacturers, because they were in demand in Europe, they obviously saw a chance here. Oh, we can do this ourselves and get in on the market. So they tried to imitate these shawls, and that's what they were called at the start, imitation Indians. But the European weavers weren't going to produce them the same as the Indian weavers, because obviously then you're reverting back and you're going up in price again. So they were using European technology, and the loom, this was before the jacquard loom was invented. So the loom they used was the draw loom. And this is where the design was actually encoded in a set of cords which ran down beside the loom, and they were connected over pulleys down to the warp. And the drawby, this is a model of a draw loom in Paisley Museum. The drawby you can see at the side of the loom, he selects the cords as they've been pre-programmed, and the weaver throws the shuttle across, and the pattern builds up line by line on the cloth. Very, very laborious method of doing it, but a very effective method of doing it as well. So we only have one drawing of a weaver and the drawby at work in Paisley, and this is from a book of reminiscences of 80 years by a person who was actually brought up in a weaving household in Paisley. So the Paisley weavers, when they began weaving these imitation Indian shawls, they had immense difficulties doing it, and their first efforts were very tentative. So they considered, if you look at the left-hand side, it's just a plain fabric with a very narrow border sewn on all around. And if you look at the center one, you can see there's a Scottish influence in it. They're trying to imitate the Indian, but there's actually a little thistle motif in it. And then in the right-hand side, you can see it's just more a texture than really a pattern that's in it. So they were quite tentative at the start because they were trying to reach a certain level of technology and expertise where they could produce them easier. So this is the technique that they used was far, far different than the Kashmiri weavers. So the Paisley imitation Indian shawls were woven face down, and what you see on the top left-hand side is what the weaver saw when he was weaving. He didn't see the pattern. He saw all these the weft yarns. The weft yarns are floating, and they're only going into the cloth where they're needed to produce the pattern on the other side. And then at the end, they're all trimmed off. So you have here in the middle picture is what the back of the shawl looks like when it's finished. So you can see it's fuzzy and there's little threads remaining on it. And the actual front you can see on the right-hand side. So that's one of the distinguishing features between the Kashmir shawl and the imitation Indian shawl, the Paisley shawl, the European shawl, is that the back of it is fuzzy like that, where it's being trimmed. And that's related also later on to the Galway shawl. So again, they couldn't weave them all into one piece. So this particular shawl here, which you see on the left-hand side, that's I've counted 11 different pieces in that. So the cross border at the end, that was sewn on. The side borders were sewn on. And even the borders themselves weren't all woven into one piece, but you can see they're stitched together. And the design is relatively crude. It's not really very fine at the moment. The yarns are, there's very few colors in it. The forms are fairly broad, and there's no really fine details in them at the moment. This is how they would have woven some of the side borders. It'll be woven all in a one piece, and then like the top image here, and you can see there's a black line between each of them like that. So that's where they're going to cut it, and then it'll be like the bottom left. There'll be a whole ribbons of these borders, which will be sewn onto the side of the shawls. And then the ends of the shawls sometimes are also woven, the end borders. So you can see on the right-hand side, the upper one, there's a whole series of borders woven on the one loom in the one piece. And then these are cut. The fringe will be cut halfway between each of the borders, and the top will be cut along the middle line, and you'll get the border of the shawl, and that'll be woven onto the end of the shawl. But eventually, they did actually perfect this pretty fast, and the quote here is from this again refers back to how the culture of the weavers. They actually had a weavers magazine in Paisley where the weavers actually submitted articles and discussed culture and all that sort of thing. And this is from the Weavers magazine in 1818. To such perfection, they're talking about the imitation Indian shawl. They weren't called a Paisley shawl at the time, still imitation Indian. To such perfection have been brought that a plaid or shawl, which by the present slow process will take a weaver in India 2 or 3 years to execute and will cost from 70 to 100 pounds, can be made here in 8 days, the exact pattern, and sold for 10 to 12 guineas. So in today's terms, that would be the cashmere would cost maybe between £4,000 and £5,000, and the Paisley imitation would cost around £900. So you can see there's a huge, and it's almost exactly the same as the Indian shawl. And then, as I was saying earlier, they produced a huge variety of shawls because it was a fashion item. So they were changed. I mean, they used to have maybe a fashion for a year or whatever, but sometimes even in the middle of the year, the fashion would change. And again, it depended on sometimes royalty or various things would change the fashion. So they produced a lot of these different types of shawls. So the one on the left-hand side, it has been given different names. It was called the blue style because it was mainly blue. Later it became known as the pale end, and today people refer to it as the Kirking shawl because of one of the authors has decided that the woman going to church is going to wear this once and never again and all that. But so the shawl has got a different name than it originally had. Then there's the one on the top right-hand shawl side is called a moon shawl. The striped one is zebra shawl. And then the one beside the moon shawl is called a harlequin shawl. And there's one here in Galway Museum. The harlequin shawl was woven and was very fashionable just for maybe 2 years, maybe 1823, 24. And it was very colourful. The ones on the top right-hand side are borders from on paper, designs on paper that we have in the museum in one of our pattern books. And if you look at the top of the shawl, if your eye runs around the top and down the right-hand side, you'll see that's the back of the pattern. And then if you look down the left-hand side and across the bottom, that's the front of the pattern. So this is the design itself is called a harlequin design because of the blocks of very bright color in it. But the shawl itself, this type is called a turnover shawl because you catch the top right-hand corner and you'd fold it back in a triangle so that you'd see both good sides. You wouldn't see the back of it at all. So, and it's folded exactly as it is like there, so that you have a much wider view of the border, and all the decoration is shown face up. So it wouldn't be, actually what's on the mannequin here, it wouldn't be woven like that because you have one border covering the other. So you're really wasting your work at it. So that's the way, the left-hand side is the ideal way. Now, the shawl evolved during the 19th century, and the main, there's lots of different variations in it, but the main thrust of it was that the pattern expanded, got bigger, the end borders got much bigger, the side borders began to drift in towards the center. Then they began producing these vegetative, these plant forms which began to invade the center, and eventually the end borders became, it covered most of the shawl, the side borders moved in, and eventually had hardly anything left of the plain centers of the shawl. Only a very small piece. So this is the one on the down on the left-hand side is probably from the 1840s. The first one is probably 1810, then 1820, 1830, 1840, 1850, 1860s. And when you came to the 1860s, they produced these massive shawls which had nothing left in the middle of them really. And these were astonishing pieces of hand weaving work. That's about 11 feet long and maybe 72 inches wide. And it's completely covered in very fine, intricate details. So there's one writer who said that the Paisley shawl, and these were produced in France as well, it represents the peak of the long tradition of weaving in Europe, because it's the highest level of both in terms of technology and design. And you can see we have some very spectacular shawls in the collection. The one on the right-hand side is from France, and the middle is a detail of that shawl. It's a bird of paradise. You can see it. That's only maybe an inch, maybe by 2 inches. And then the one on the left-hand side is a Paisley production, and there's probably a one-off, I would think, or maybe, well, they'll probably produce a couple of them, but it wouldn't be a fashion item as such. And it was that this iconography was popular for some reason or other, and it's really a celebration of the Persian New Year, the New Row. So it is a phenomenal piece of work as well. And this is probably our most spectacular shawl. It's a French one, which is in the Paisley Museum. And I think it's a design by a famous French shawl designer, Barras. And he produced hundreds of designs. And if you look at the piece on the right-hand side, and then if you cast your eye back into the center of the shawl, and you can see the birds of paradise, well, this represents maybe 2 square inches to the left of that. And you can see it's completely covered in all sorts of intricate designs, people, animals, architectural details, everything. The shawl is completely covered in this, and this is all done on a handloom. A lot of people make the mistake, they think that the powerloom was in advance of handloom weaving. It's only with today's electronic computer-aided design that loom has actually caught up, and it hasn't really fully caught up with the handloom weaving. The difference between the handloom weaving and the powerloom weaving was solely in power, that they introduced the power into weaving so that the weaver didn't operate the loom. It was either by steam, by water, or by electricity. And they had to really revert back to a much more primitive type of cloth, because the powerloom wasn't advanced enough. But of course, it improved all the time. But it never ever caught up on the proficiency of the handloom until very recently. I remember a few years ago there was a Japanese company who, I'm digressing here now, but there was a Japanese company who thought it was fantastic because they produced an item, a vest, a singlet, which straight off the loom and you could wear it. Now, if they knew their history, they would know that this had been done before the jacquard was invented on the draw loom, and they had seamless shirts. There's a seamless shirt in the museum in Glasgow where the whole thing is done on the loom. The collars, the frills, the buttonholes, all the sleeves and all that, and it was all done without any needlework whatsoever. And it was produced on a hand loom, a draw loom. So they still haven't caught up with the skill and the technology of the handloom weavers. The Paisley shawl had maybe a flaw in the production in that it was wasteful in a way, but as I showed you earlier, the back of the shawl was covered in yarn, loose yarn, and this had to be sheared off. Initially, it was sheared off by hand by girls who'd use scissors or clippers to clip it off. Then they produced a machine for doing it. So they'd have to remove all this, which was recycled into paper making and things like that, or maybe produce shoddy. Shoddy is another textile term. It's where you'd spin yarns from the waste of other products, and you maybe dye it black rather than try and get good colors on it. And so this here, you can see the top is what the weaver would see. Then whoever was clipping this didn't finish it, thanks be to God, because we can see both. We can see how it looks, and so you can see, and then the face is the front of the shawl is shown below. So this was a problem, and that's why they wove the shawls so big sometimes, because they had to fold them in such a way as to hide the back of the shawl. So in the late 1860s and the early 70s, they produced what they call a reversible shawl. So it was good on both sides. So they didn't have to do any clipping of it. There was no waste yarn, and they didn't have to weave it as long. So it was woven half as long as the long shawls. So, but this was the swan song of the Paisley shawl. It was really too late to rescue the shawl trade. It was the last of that particular breed of shawl that they produced in Paisley. And it's called the reversible shawl. A very, very complicated piece of work. I maybe digress again. I think that somebody told me one time that that's how the lawnmower was invented. You see the way they're clipping the shawl here, that somebody invented a machine to actually take away all the extra weft from the back of the thing. And he took it to the textile trade, and they didn't accept it. They just thought this is not going to work. So he took it to the horticultural trade, and it became the lawnmower. So it's the very same idea. It's a rotary blade, and it cuts the pile on the thing. Don't quote me on that. I'm just quoting someone else, so I haven't verified it. But it's an interesting story. If you say it often enough, it's true. But anyway, at the end of the trade, the last of the Paisley shawls were woven in between the 1870 and 1880. That's really when it died out. And the situation, as I told you, with the weavers, they were working in their own workshops. So the manufacturers didn't own the looms or anything. So the weavers were left with their looms on their hands and all that. And you can see from this picture on the top left is a picture of an interior of a workshop in Paisley in 1883. And if you look at the bottom of that image, you can see there's a part of another loom there. And that's originally a jacquard loom. You can see the jacquard head on the top. The jacquard has been taken apart, and they're now weaving plain cloth on it. And here's three weavers on the right-hand side. And to their right, you can see the remnants of another loom, or maybe two looms. So it's the end of the peak of weaving in Paisley, and they're dismantling things, they're taking them apart. And there was lots of some people were quite glad at the thing, because the weavers went through, it wasn't a good trade to be in at the end of the century, although at the start of the century it was a very, very good trade to be in. But by the end, it was they were very, very poorly paid. They had to work long hours. They still had the pride in the weaving. Some of them refused to go into factories, for instance. They'd prefer a lower standard of living doing their weaving but very few young people went into it. So it's dying out at about 100 looms a year at this stage were going out in Paisley. And initially they had about 7,000 weavers. So it was going down very rapidly. So the manufacturers, some of them stayed on, and they diversified, and they produced different fabrics. The top left-hand side is, believe it or not, a poncho. They produced ponchos for the South American market. They produced curtain materials, tartans, tweeds, bedspreads, and at some time or other, we don't know exactly when, they produced this heavy woolen shawl, which you see down at the bottom, right, which they call the fur shawl. We don't exactly know when it was introduced, but it was at the end of the shawl trade. And it was a completely different type of shawl than the previous ones. And it was sold to completely different markets as well. So it was, as I said, a very heavy woolen shawl, but which if you think of the earlier shawls, which are fashion items, you'd wear them to a ball, you couldn't wear this to a ball. This is really for outdoor wear, heavy woolen shawl, and it's ideal for outdoor wear because when they're weaving these, they go through a finishing process at the end of when it comes off the loom. It's scoured and felted and shrunk, fulled, they call it. And for instance, they might be woven 72 inches wide, which is a standard width for these. And then they would be fulled and washed and scoured and all, and it'd bring them into maybe 60 inches or so. All the intersections would close in, and then they'd raise a nap on it, which is a pile on the surface of it. And that's why they call them the fur shawl or the velvet shawl. The velvet is actually a technical term in the textile trade for raising a vertical nap on the cloth. There's different, you can produce curly naps on it, all that sort of thing. But they raised this vertical nap on it, and these were extremely warm pieces of clothing, and they were woven, as I said, they were worn outdoor, and they were sold, and a lot of them were sold to the west of Ireland, and the girls selling flowers in Piccadilly Square would wear them as well. And of course, that's the same circumstances. They're out in the weather, and they're protected from the weather by this fur shawls. So Paisley Museum has only 2 full fur shawls, believe it or not, and there's a roll. The 3 strips in the middle are all from the one roll. We have a design for one shawl here as well. That's the only design we have for a fur shawl, and we have plenty of samples as well. These are 2 blankets, which are they're not. I mean, they're sewn together but I'm not too sure whether they're ever used as a blanket. I have no idea why they were sewn together. But there's over 60 samples in the big one on the left-hand side, and all different patterns. And I've looked at them, and maybe there's probably 30 of them woven on the one loom. Then there's some woven on different looms. You can, by looking at them and especially if one runs into the other, you can tell what them 2 are woven on the same loom. And the one on the right-hand side is this belongs to the Small Shaw Cottages, which is a small museum in Paisley, and they're actually lighter fabrics, and some of them have. Like if you look at the bottom, some of them, well, maybe you can't see it on the bottom, but some of them don't have any decors. They just have plain borders, which was an early type of fur shawl as well. So basically that's what we have on the fur shawl in Paisley Museum. The information that we have on the fur shawl comes mostly from one man, who is A.M. Stewart. And he was actually a shawl designer in the trade, and at the end of the trade. And he was also very like his predecessors in the trade. He was a polymath. He was very interested in entomology, the study of insects and butterflies. He actually introduced a new method of displaying butterflies. He wrote about 6 or 7 natural history books. He wrote articles for the local newspaper, and it's he that actually gave us the tiny bit of literature which we have on the fur shawl. And it was he wrote this book. It's the history and romance of the Paisley shawl, which is really a collection of articles that he'd written for the local newspaper. And then there's another one, Paisley Shawl, at the end of the chapter, which appeared in the Scottish Home and Country magazine in August of 1932. And he mentions the fur shawls in that. He was also a very accomplished artist as well. So he was very reminiscent of the earlier weavers in the 19th century. And that's the only photograph, that comes from his article on the Paisley shawl at the end of the chapter, and it's the only photograph we have of a weaver in Paisley actually in situ weaving. We have another one in the museum, but this is a weaver in situ, he's weaving a fur shawl. And this is in 1932, and he's 68 years of age, I think. And he's originally from Alva, because some of the weavers in Paisley at that time came from Alva, and they were weaving these heavy woolen shawls. In 1941, I think, the last company in Paisley producing any hand-woven cloth, but they were actually fur shawl weavers, Hayton and Clark was the name, and they finished trading in 1941. And in 1943, the Paisley Museum got one of their last of the two looms, and it was set up in the museum. And a weaver, which you can see here by the name of Mr. Clark, actually wove a shawl on the loom. So this is the very last piece of weaving from the long, long tradition of weaving in Paisley. No more hand weaving in Paisley after that. And the very last act of it was actually in Paisley Museum. And what they were weaving was a fur shawl. So if you look at the bottom of the image on the bottom there, you can see how similar this is to the original Paisley shawl. You can see the weft patterns floating across the back of that. This is a section and that's what you can see what he's weaving, because it's woven face down. You see the back of it, and what you see is all these yarns floating on the back, which will have to be clipped off. And if you look at the Galway shawls here, you'll see the way they're clipped on the back as well. So that's the shawl which was woven in. It says that was woven in the museum in our register. I sometimes doubt it, but I think the wove maybe a smaller sample or something. But the reason I doubt this is because this has the nap raised on it, which means it's been taken off the loom and it's gone to a factory where they've actually put it through a moser and raised the fur surface on it. So although it definitely says in the register, woven in Paisley Museum, and the design, we know the designer of it, it's A.M. Stewart, the man I showed you a few slides ago. So, and this is the very same design as it appears on, for instance, Maureen O'Hara's shawl. And so we actually know who designed that shawl. So we've got our shawls, images of them taken as well. And the one on the left is the shawl that was woven on the loom in Paisley Museum. The one on the right is one of the Galway shawls in the collection here. You can see they're the very same design, except a different colorway. And it's interesting how both photographers use exactly the same technique in photographing them. So the other source we have for the Paisley shawl is, of course, the numerous images which we can see here and in lots of other sources of the different fur shawls or Galway shawls that are woven in Paisley. And we have, I think the shawl we have, or the shawl that is here in the museum, has this pattern on the left-hand side. We were looking at comparing it yesterday with Brendan, and it's the same design, same pattern. So now I'm going to run through how the shawl was made, because it was a very complex process. It was certainly not the work of the weaver alone. It was it was really the work of a community of different tradespeople. There was one book written on the Paisley shawl in 1904, again by a person from Paisley, and he was a textile man himself, and he enumerated 13 different trades involved in it. But I think there might have been, it depends on the type and the style, but generally speaking, there's 12 to 15 trades involved in producing the shawl. The very first thing you have to think of when you're producing it is, from a textile point of view, is the actual fibers themselves. These make a huge difference to the finished product. So you can see here the comparison of the different fibers. And if you think back to when I said that the Paisley weavers produced exact replicas or style of the cashmere shawl, they actually produced them in such abundance that they had the boldness to try and break into the Indian market. And when they brought them over to India and they showed them to the shawl traders and the shawl makers in India, the shawl makers and the shawl traders in India were astonished. They said, "This is wonderful. How did you do this?" And when they touched the shawls and handled it, they said, "Oh no, this is not the cashmere shawl, because it was made from a different fiber." And that's also a technical term in textiles, is the handle of the cloth. So if you're an experienced textile person, your hands tell you a lot about the cloth. So when they looked at the surface of the shawl, they just thought this is phenomenal. But when they looked at it, they just turned around and said, "No, this is not the real thing." So they just said, "No, we're not having it." But that's why I say the fiber is really, really important, the choice of fiber. And of course, the fiber wasn't available in Europe because it was produced, as I said, from the underbelly of the Himalayan goat. They did make some very brave attempts to naturalize the goats in Europe, but they had one attempt which they put all the male goats on one boat and all the female goats on another boat and headed for Europe, and one of the boats sank. So that put an end to that. But they did manage to rear a small flock of goats somewhere down near London, I think. But the goats weren't acclimatized here, so they were getting diseases which they wouldn't get in the Himalayas, foot rot and things like that. But they did manage to harvest a small amount. And there is a Paisley shawl, which we don't have, which was woven from cashmere yarn in Britain, but it just simply didn't work. So they used substitute yarns like merino and spun silk, things like that. That's, as I was saying, it's really important, no matter what fabric you're producing, whether it's linen, cotton, wool, or whatever, to source the yarns really well. And if you look at modern agricultural methods, for instance, how the sheep is fed while she's pregnant will affect the quality of the fiber that the lamb will produce in later life. So it's you're going back really to horticulture, or I should say to agriculture, to animal husbandry and all that. And it's the same with the plants, the cotton and all that. How they're grown will affect. So for instance, the cotton up in the top right-hand side, you have lots of different qualities of cotton, and probably the best quality is the Egyptian long staple cotton. So cotton is a generic term, but there's a huge range of qualities inside it, which come from different sources. The land will make a big difference to the quality of the fiber. The same with linen. Now, the next thing is the spinning of the yarn. Now, a yarn is not simply just what you'll see, the fibers just spun in a certain way. There's a whole field of design in a yarn. There's so many different types of ways of spinning and all that, and that really affects the end product. Even if you put more twist in a yarn, it'll affect the cloth much different than if you put fewer twists per inch in it. So if you look at the image on the right-hand side, both of them are wool yarns, but the one on the inner one is worsted, which means they've taken off all the long fibers, they've spun them together to get a much finer yarn from that. And the woolen one is where they've put all the loftier, coarser yarns, shorter fibers, I should say. And that's what would have been used in to raise the nap on the cloth. All them fibers would be pulled up like that. So you would never use a worsted yarn for a Galway shawl. You'd use a woolen yarn so that the fibers can be raised on it. So when you're weaving fancy fabrics like that, there's two different elements to producing them. There's the visual element, which is that, and it's all under the umbrella of design. And then there's the technical element. The technical element is very akin to engineering, which I'll show you in the next slides, because it's all measurements and fitting things together properly. So people forget this, but for a textile designer, there's a whole range of calculations you have to do, formulae and all that. Now, I should say that if I, for instance, wanted to design and weave a Galway shawl, I'd have to go through all this calculations. But once I have one shawl, all the solutions got, then I can reproduce loads of them. But for the start, you have to go through this, the diameter of the yarns, how they intersect with each other, how they're going to be finished, all that sort of thing. So there's a huge area that you have to be very familiar with the calculations. And as I said, years ago, when you're producing cloth and you have a tradition of weaving and you're producing the same cloth over a century, you'd probably use the traditional, the weaver probably wouldn't need to do any calculations. But if you're introducing new cloths like they were in Paisley with the fashion fabrics, then you'd have to be able to get all your calculations right, because if you just decided, well, we're going to produce this and it turned out wrong, you're wasting a huge amount of time. And that's where the word sleazy as well is a technical term for cloth. It's usually too loosely woven. So it's very, very loose and so shoddy is a textile term, so is sleazy. I won't tell you the other ones. So this is the yarn. So if there's all sorts of different systems of calculating the diameter of the yarns as well. And in the 19th century, it was absolutely notorious because they had different systems in different districts. But then they tried to codify it all into, so they managed to get it down to mainly cotton, worsted, linen, and the major yarns or fiber types. So for instance, if and I do this myself when I'm working, if I want to order yarn, I'll say I want a 220s cotton, or I want a 242s cotton, or whatever, or I want a single cotton. And I'll calculate how much. So supposing if I wanted to weave a shawl out of them cones there, I would take out the cone, I would maybe determine its diameter, and then by weighing it, if it's cotton, I'll be able to calculate exactly how much yarn is on each cone, and I'll be able to do the calculations to see have I enough for it and all that. So there's lots of different calculations like that. And then of course the structure of the cloth. This is where I was talking about the engineering aspect of it, because if you blow up the fabrics, they're actually constructed, and in actual fact, in the textile trade, they call it the build of the cloth, or building the cloth. So on the left-hand side, you can see the weft is going in. It's a 2-2 twill cloth. The drawing beside that is a 1-3 twill cloth. So, and then how closely they're spaced. If you looked at the right-hand side, you can see there's the little dots represent the warp, and the twined drawing represents the weft, and there's the exact amount of weft and warp in each of these, but because they're different structures, you can see one is much narrower than the other, or so that there'll be a closer thing. And you have to be very careful that you don't overset it, you don't set them too close, it'll be too boardy, the cloth won't work right, you have to get the drape right, all that sort of thing. But as I say, once you have that right, then you can proceed to produce lots of the same item. So the shawl makers years ago had people produced booklets or guides to help the people who are designing the clothes in their calculations. So there's 3 different types of tables there: the reed table, the shot table, the yard table, and you'll open them up and you'll see, oh, well, I'm going to try and weave 50 inches wide with such and such yarn. This is what I need, and all that. So you really have to be familiar with all these things. Now the Paisley shawl, as I said, initially it was woven on the draw loom, but after the introduction of the jacquard loom, most of them were woven on the jacquard loom. And the jacquard loom, the pattern is actually encoded into a set of cards, which you can see on the bottom, the second from the left. That contains the pattern of the cloth, and they're put on the loom. The weaver operates the loom, and the cloth comes out like on the left-hand side here. So that would represent the pattern encoded into the cards and coming out on the cloth as the weaver works away. So the first thing the designer has to do, whether they're producing a Paisley shawl or a Galway shawl, is to do what they call a sketch. And a sketch it was done by a particular person called a pattern drawer. They weren't called a designer, they were called a pattern drawer. And the sketch is usually done the same size and color as it will appear on the cloth. And although for some of the bigger shawls, they'll do scale drawings for them. It's called a sketch because it shows what the pattern will look like on the cloth, but there's no technical details in it. So it's like an architect's sketch for a building, which you can see what the building will look like, but there's no details as how much concrete you're using or metal or anything like that. So it's an architect's sketch. This is a designer sketch although when you think in terms of art, these are as good as finished artworks, but they're still called a sketch in the trade. And you can see here how we can see from some of the unfinished sketches how they actually approach this in Paisley. The top one here is actually from a pattern drawer's notebook in the end of the 19th century. And you can see he has a print of some scroll work, and he's actually using this as inspiration for producing drawings. And then you can see the drawings will be done in pencil, and when they've perfected the pencil work, they'll start coloring it in. And it's usually done in like a modern equivalent of gouache. So it's solid colors put in, painted in. And of course, the person, they'll have to get the color balance right and all that. And also you'll have to think, it's very careful where you put in the colors, because that'll affect how much you're going to put into the weaving. So you're not going to, for instance, produce, supposing you're using 3 colors and you decide, oh, you had like a big red there in the middle. The next step is it's marked out in squares. for the next step, which is you're going to put it onto design paper or point paper. And these come in a huge, huge variety of ways of gauges. So you can see there's a 4x12, and this depends on the ratio of the warp and the weft in the cloth. So you have to be very careful you pick out the right design paper. This is an ad for design paper in Paisley in the 19th century, and there's over 100 different types of paper available to designers. The design is then put on the cloth or put on the paper like this, and you end up with the finished design. And the top is this is an actual sketch and the corresponding design. And you can see the design is much larger than the sketch. And this here is the square is a little detail of the sketch, and this is the corresponding detail of the sketch on point paper. And the idea of the point paper is that it's used as a guide in cutting the cards, and the cards are cut using this machine here called a piano card cutting machine. So the design is put up on the reading board. The card cutter sits at the front and selects the punches according to what he's seeing on the paper and punches the card. So you can see the card here on the right-hand side as it's being punched. And then the cards, you're left with a bundle of cards, all numbered, and they all have to be laced together in sequence. Very, very careful to lace them without making mistakes. And then they're put on the loom and they're run through the jacquard. And every time the weaver presses his foot on the jacquard loom, one card selects the hooks and consequently the warp threads to be lifted. And the jacquard, of course, itself, the harness has to be designed. So this is a design for a jacquard harness. That's very important, that all the threads, all the cords coming down from the jacquard can be drawn into the comber board in many, many different ways for different style patterns. So if you look at these here, for instance, you have a point repeat, you have a straight over, you have borders. All them will affect how the actual loom is set up. The harness is tied into the loom. Once the design work is finished, you have to warp the yarn. So the yarn is put on spools, and then the spools are put, the yarn has to be dyed as well. These are some of the dyes used in Paisley shawls. And then the spools are put on a rack, which you can see on the right-hand side here. And the yarn is translated then from the spools into a long train of what do you call it, yarn to put on the back of the loom, on the weaver's beam. And then it has to be from here. This is how it's put on the beam. It's put into this spacer called a raddle, and then if you look at the bottom, it's wound onto the back beam using a beaming machine, and then it has to be drawn through the heddles as well, or tied in. It can be knotted in. If you're finished one warp and the other is exactly the same, you can actually knot them in one by one, and then it has to be drawn through the reed, and the reed determines how fine the cloth is and how coarse it's going to be. So you get all the different qualities of reed as well. And the weft yarn has to be wound onto bobbins, which is very carefully done as well, because it has to come out from the bobbin. It's put in the shuttle, and as the shuttle flies across 60 times a minute, it has to come off very evenly off the pern, which is the bobbin it's wound on. So that's very important. And then the cloth has to be inspected and finished and darned if there's any mistakes in it or whatever, and maybe fringed or finished in some decorative manner like that. And that's then the end product. I'll just run through this. This is, as a weaver and curator of textiles, I've collected looms and handloom weaving equipment from around Britain and set up a weaving department in Paisley Museum where we demonstrate weaving and also teach weaving. So I have researched various types of shawl and reproduced some types on the looms in the museum. So this is some of, actually this is all my work here on the right-hand side. So it's various shawls I've woven. And part of my research, I was interested in the fur shawls, which I hadn't realized came from, or was the same as the Galway shawls. So you analyze them to see the structure of the cloth. But I saw this in A.M. Stewart's article, and I thought, oh, that they could be Galway shawls, but you couldn't see them clearly enough. So I came across this cutting from a paper, which said they were embroidered shawls. But I knew from looking at this that this was the exact same as the shawl in Paisley Museum. So I pursued a bit of research, and I came to Galway, and Tom Kenny generously did an article in the paper and asked people to add the shawls that I could examine. And we only got 2 replies. And one was a Mrs. Madden from Ballinasloe. And I went in and looked at her shawl and I discovered it was the same pattern as the pattern on the paper in Paisley Museum. So I pursued this line and I examined the pattern and I figured out how what the dots and what the marks, and because this is a completely different method of designing than the earlier Paisley shawls, because now you have to cut the cards in a different way. So I figured out what these dots meant and all that, and I cut the cards and I wove an example on the loom, which is the same as Mrs. Madden's shawl. And that's, I hadn't the loom set up that you could weave the full shawl, so I wove it the same length as the shawl and just the cross borders on each end. And the one on the right is Mrs. Madden's shawl, and the one on the left is what I've woven. So it's pretty close in you can hardly tell the difference. I just used what yarns we had, and if I wanted to do it completely exactly the same, I'd examine things that I order exactly the same yarns. But I think I got a fairly good. And then I wove a much lighter shawl. Somebody gave me cashmere yarn. They were in the knitwear industry, and I wove this much lighter shawl on it. And I wove another one of these, and we had an old weaver from Varanasi in India, and he took a fancy to it, and he wore it back to India. So I was just thinking, there it is, the full circle. It came from India, and now we have an Indian weaver wearing the shawl back to India. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a slide for that one. So that's basically it.